This Can't Be Happening at MacDonald Hall by Gordon Korman, age 12. Chapter 4. Assignment Obnoxious. By the time Boots awoke the next morning, George had already returned from breakfast. He was examining the morning paper and checking his charts, making adjustments with a red pen. "Morning," Boots murmured. "How's Magnico?" Recovering, George said briskly, as though he had no time for small talk. Boots, a notorious morning sneezer, rattled off 4 violent "achooes" in a row. Immediately, George whipped out a disinfectant and began to spray the entire room, giving special attention to Boots's bed. "Germs!" he cried in a panic. "You didn't tell me you had a cold! I would have put up my screen!" Boots stared, first amused and then disgusted, as George wheeled out a large screen and placed it between the 2 beds. On Boots's side was a sign that said, "Quarantine." "Cut it out," Boots protested. "I haven't got a cold. I always sneeze in the morning when I wake up." Reluctantly, George put away the screen. "I'll take your word for it," he said. "But sneezing does spread germs, you know. You ought to keep a paper bag beside your bed, and every morning you can sneeze into it and put it out with the trash to be burned." Boots started to insist on his right to sneeze anywhere he wanted, but then gave up and began to get dressed. Before he was finished, George had turned from his charts, picked up an armload of books, and headed for his first class of the day, Advanced Economics. A few minutes later, Boots set out for his own math class, but not before making a point of coughing on George's pillow. Boots was in a foul mood. He knew that Bruno was going to be in that class too, and that they would not even be allowed to say hello to one another. His world had become a very uncomfortable place. Elmer's alarm shrilled at the usual 6 a.m. Bruno managed to open one eye and was vaguely aware of a headache. "What time is it?" he mumbled. "It is exactly 6 o'clock, Elmer said. "A.M.?" Bruno cried in dismay. "You bet," Elmer said brightly. "There's lots of work to be done before breakfast." "Like what?" Bruno snarled. It was his habit to miss breakfast, sleep until 8:45, then make a frantic effort to get washed and dressed into his first class on time. "I have to check on my goldfish experiment," Elmer explained, "and make some notes. Then I have several other experiments to tend to, and my aunts to take care of." Bruno sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed, then paused. "Is it safe to stand on the floor?" he asked. "I wouldn't want to step on anybody important." "Oh, perfectly safe," said Elmer. "They're still sleeping." "That proves they've got more brains than we have, Elmer. But since I'm awake, I may as well unpack." Bruno heaved his suitcase onto his bed and threw it open. He went over to the large dresser and pulled out the bottom drawer. "This one mine?" "No!" Bruno was frozen by Elmer's anguished scream. He stared down into the drawer. Lining the bottom were dozens of tiny pots of earth with little plants sprouting in them. "You've ruined my experiment!" Elmer wailed. "Those plants were supposed to be in total darkness for 144 hours. Ugh, now I'll have to start all over." "What do you have plants in a drawer for?" Bruno asked. "I'm a botanist," Elmer explained. "My world is the world of plants." "I always thought you were a bit earthy, Elmer," Bruno grunted. "But this is too much. Just where do I keep my underwear?" "Couldn't you keep it in your suitcase for the next 6 days?" Elmer pleaded. "Oh, all right," Bruno agreed. "Anything for you, Elmer." Washed, dressed, and at least half awake, Bruno arrived at the dining room for his first breakfast ever at MacDonald Hall. Wearily, he picked up a tray and walked over to where 2 elderly women in white uniforms were dishing out breakfast. "Look, Martha," one said, "a new boy." She turned to Bruno. "Welcome to MacDonald Hall, dear. When did you arrive?" The other boys being served hooted loudly. "This is my 2nd year," Bruno grinned sheepishly. "I guess I'm just not much for breakfast." But, unaccustomed as he was to eating early, he quickly managed to put away 3 scrambled eggs, 6 strips of bacon, 4 large pancakes with maple syrup, 2 pieces of toast, and 3 glasses of milk. "It's a good thing you don't come to breakfast too often," one student observed as Bruno was downing the last of his milk. "They'd have to raise the fees just to feed you." Bruno patted his stomach. "That was delicious. You know, I might even come again sometime." As he entered the math class, he noted that Boots was already there, sitting as far away from his usual place as possible without actually being outside the room. He also found that he was incapable of giving his friend the usual smile of greeting, forbidden or not. Breakfast was sitting very heavily on his stomach. He felt sick. The geometry class was a horrendous experience for both of them. Bruno was trying to keep his spirits up and his breakfast down, and Boots was yawning hugely. So the teacher was confronted on one side with Bruno's green face, and on the other with Boots' gaping mouth. "Are we keeping you up, O'Neill?" he finally demanded. "Sorry, sir," said Boots. "I was up late last night. I guess I'm pretty tired." The teacher turned to Bruno. I think you should have stayed in bed this morning, Walton. You don't look well at all. Oh, it's nothing, sir, replied Bruno. I just ate too much breakfast. A boy in the front row turned around. Breakfast? You? That will do, said the teacher. Walton, I'm sending you back to bed. Here's your authorization. He scribbled a few words on a piece of paper and handed it over. Bruno was more than happy to obey. Boots sat in a corner of the dining room, munching on a sandwich. News of Mr. Sturgeon's order had spread. Boots's friends, sensing that he was in a grim mood, left him alone, although 5 of them sat conspicuously at a table for 6 with one chair pulled out invitingly in case he chose to join them. He didn't. He was very much aware that Bruno had not come to lunch. He must be sick. Really sick, Boots thought. And a lot Elmer Grimsdale was going to care. Bruno spent most of the day in bed, although as soon as his mammoth breakfast had settled, he felt considerably better. He lay there thinking. Elmer hates me, he mused cheerfully. I'd like to booby-trap one of his experiments, but that would just make him mad. He'd probably complain to the fish. Instantly, an amazing plan sprouted in Bruno's fertile mind, one that he was later to call his glorious idea. He was still in bed when Elmer came in at 4 o'clock. Are you still sick? His roommate asked solicitously. Sort of, Bruno answered, touched by Elmer's concern and a little ashamed of his earlier thoughts and plans. Gee, that's swell! Elmer rummaged through a large crate which stood beside his desk and produced a high-magnification microscope and a box of glass slides. I'd like to study your germs, he explained. Would you mind coughing onto this slide? Yes, I would mind very much, Bruno growled. Why? I'm a microbiologist, Elmer answered. My world is the microbe world. I always thought you were very small, Elmer, said Bruno wearily. Go away. Elmer mumbled something about lack of cooperation and reluctantly put away his experiment. Oh, don't take it so hard, Elmer, Bruno reassured him. Maybe someday I'll catch something really good, and then I'll let you culture it. Really and truly? Elmer asked hopefully. Really and truly, replied Bruno. I promise to do my very best to get some terrible disease. He watched as his roommate made the rounds of his experiments. Carefully and lovingly, Elmer restarted the plant experiment and shut the bottom drawer of the dresser, reminding Bruno that he had only 144 more hours to live out of his suitcase. The ants had completed an entire new tunnel, and he rewarded them with a spoonful of sugar. Everything was going along swimmingly in the bathtub, although no fry had hatched yet, but the fish tank was not quite so serene. My algae eater, Elmer explained. He's dead! Maybe it was something he ate, Bruno suggested. Look how sick I got from having breakfast. Have you been near this tank? Elmer asked suspiciously. I haven't even looked in its direction, Bruno defended himself. Fish are not my idea of a good time, unless they're dipped in batter and served with french fries. I guess I cleaned the tank too thoroughly, Elmer decided, and didn't leave him enough food. Poor devil. Bruno rolled over, turned his face to the wall, and switched on his portable radio. No, no, Elmer cried. What now? Turn that off this instant. The noise is bad for my plants. Your plants are closed up in the drawer, Bruno yelled. They can't even hear it. Not those plants, these plants. Elmer swept open the curtains to reveal a triple row of pots on the windowsill. I see, sighed Bruno, and switched off his radio, more determined than ever that Elmer had to go. When Boots returned from classes, he found George on his hands and knees washing the room with alcohol. Good, you're back, said George. Watch carefully, please. Next week it will be your turn for sterilizing duty. It has to be done every second day. What do you wash? Boots asked in amazement, wrinkling his nose from the strong odor. Everything, George replied. Ceiling? Walls? Asked Boots. Furniture? And everything else, George added. What happens if I want to smoke in this fire trap? Smoke? George cried. Smoking is hazardous to your health. I absolutely forbid it. Besides, it's against the rules. You wouldn't dare. Boots, who had never smoked in his life, thought of taking it up just to irritate George. All right, he said when his anger had cooled. Your idea of sterilizing the room is terrific. You do it. He strode to the window and threw it open, stifling George's cry of protest with a look that would have melted steel. It stinks in here, he said bluntly, and sat down at his desk to do his homework. After a while, George said, May I please shut the window? It's getting very chilly. Boots, who was freezing but not ready to admit it, replied, Certainly, I wouldn't want you to catch pneumonia. That was the end of their conversation for the rest of the evening. Boots arrived at the cannon 10 minutes early to find Bruno already there. All right, Bruno, this is it, he declared. Either you come up with an idea tonight, or I go AWOL. The third is driving me nuts. He proceeded to describe in detail the fine points of sterilizing duty. And this morning when I sneezed, you know how I sneeze when I wake up, He sprayed the room and put a quarantine screen up to isolate me. I just can't stand anymore. Shh, stop yelling, Bruno whispered. The old Walton brain came through. I have developed a glorious idea. Are you with me? I'll do anything, Boots vowed. Tell me. Bruno left the cover of the bushes to retrieve their bag of food from the cannon. They sat together and began to chew on some dried-out bread. It's really very simple, Bruno said. George and Elmer don't like us very much. But what if they hated us? I mean, really hated us, enough to go to the fish and complain about us. What good would that do? Boots protested. We'd just get into more trouble. Now stop and think, said Bruno. The fish is punishing us, not them. They're the two best little boys in the whole school. If they demand to be rid of us, the fish is bound to give in. And where does that leave us? Change the office wall, probably, Boots muttered. Well, have you got a better idea? Bruno demanded. No, Boots admitted glumly. Well then, this is it. Starting tomorrow, we make ourselves so obnoxious that good old George and sweet little Elmer will run screaming to the fish to complain.